Looks like it's working.
Awesome. Yeah, I see it. I got the message.
I think we're live too.
Wonderful.
This is gonna be fun. Well, let's give it a shot and see what. Let's do it live. We'll just figure out, the usual. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. What could possibly go wrong? Get my background looking right here.
Looks like it's working.
All righty. Perfect. Yeah, I see it. I got the message.
I think we're live too. This
Wonderful.
is gonna be fun. Well, let's give it a shot and see what. Let's do it live. We'll just figure out, the usual. What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. What could possibly go wrong? Get my background looking right here.
Now, is that me creating a? Is that me creating a feedback loop? Yep, it is me creating a feedback loop.
Yep, sounds like you, man.
Like I said, we'll do it live. We'll figure out what could possibly go wrong. Okay, this thing is breaking. All right. Okay. I think we're live by all accounts because it looks like everything is connected. So we're trying something new. Apologies for the fun technical difficulties. I think
Yeah,
that,
good times.
yeah, we're trying to see if we can stream to multiple platforms concurrently, trying to reach out to more people. So, yeah, let's see what happens. So, welcome everyone to the podcast. I'm Josh. That's Al. And well, surprise in a sense that this podcast was not planned. It was supposed to be next week, but
Yep.
welcome to the fun of work schedules. Things
Yeah.
shifted all the time. So Al doesn't have to travel, and I'm available, so we're recording.
And we're recording. Yeah, it's rarely do we hear I don't have to travel. That's it's rare, but it's welcomed. I tell you, it's welcomed. So
Welcome to that consulting life, right?
that's right. That's right. Road warriors.
Awesome. Okay. So, I think it's streaming this week on, we're trying out streaming on my platform personally on LinkedIn. So if you're watching from LinkedIn, hello. If you're chatting, also, I'm not paying attention to the chat much. So, probably the only chat I'm going to be paying attention to, is going to be the YouTube one. So if you're want to find us on the Cyber Lab YouTube, go ahead and look for that. I'll probably be monitoring that way more. But anyways,
I'll try to bring up the LinkedIn here, see if I can. If so, if you do send anything on LinkedIn, I'll hopefully chime in with any questions you have.
awesome. All right, folks. So this week, Al and I thought let's do something fun on the current event side. Tariffs, trade wars, and the unintended consequences of that. And, I think regardless of where you're positioned, whether you're for or against tariffs, that's one thing. But we want to talk about the unintended consequences, the unintended side effects of tariffs. And, as those of you who are regular listeners podcasts, Al and I each week take a different subject and we apply it to risk, how we look at and how we look at security, whether it be from cyber, physical, operational, national security, or so forth. So we're looking from that perspective. We're not going to be arguing whether tariffs are good or bad. We're just looking at the side effects of tariffs, and you can make the opinion on whether it's good or bad. Anyways, I think this is where we're coming from, at least my perspective, Al. I keep thinking about tariffs, and I keep thinking about prohibition from the 1920s, and I kind of think like, what could go wrong?
Right.
And there's a part of me that goes and says, if I had $1 billion right now, I would set up a foreign company in Mexico or Canada and use that as a hub to import goods for the US and didn't just bring it across the border and then just pay the lower tariff instead of the 145% tariff or whatever like that. Or, bounce around a couple countries that has free trade agreements. May take 60 days longer, but you'll potentially save a lot more money. Who
I mean,
knows?
when you talk about 145% tariff on a good, right? I mean, I, I don't, I've never heard of a tariff that high, personally. Um, and I'm sure there's a strategy behind it somewhere, but the reality of the situation is when you have a tariff that clearly the I mean, this is a punitive tariff, right? Against China. And, we can argue the merits of it's deserved, it's not deserved, or whatever. That, like, that's not what we're going to discuss here today. But I think what we have to look at is the first, second, third, fourth, fifth order effects of something like that, right? On probably the number one manufacturer and exporter of raw materials on the planet right now. So, okay, so let's kind of break this down, as to the base level that we can, right? So, okay, raw materials. Let's start there. All right. So if you're exporting raw materials out of China and you have a 145% tariff on that raw material directly to the US, right? And that's what I think people don't realize. It's like this is not a global tariff. This is a tariff from China to directly to the US, right? So if I've put that barrier, that economic barrier on you, and you're the PRC, you're in China looking at economic policy, what is your response likely going to be? My opinion, okay, let's use a third party kind of intermediary as a place to drop off raw materials and then get that material into the US on a lower tariff, kind of like what you mentioned, right? And then there's the other aspect of this, which Americans aren't too familiar with, but I think most everyone in the world is. It's a value added tax, right? VAT, which kind of carries over. And the best way I can explain a VAT is essentially the originator of the goods sends something to another country or down the supply chain, right, for processing. So in this example, we're going to use Chinese steel. China sends steel to a mill somewhere, raw ore, all right, to a mill somewhere. That mill then processes the steel. But because of the VAT, that VAT is added to the refined ore, right? And then it's shipped on to the next part of the value chain. And then the VAT is then added again and again and again. And essentially the consumer pays a different margin, a different price to recoup the cost of the VAT. And each country will then send you a check back for whatever VAT cost was in the value chain back to each of the producers in home countries. So it's a little complicated because we don't really do business like that in the US, but the rest of the world does do business like this, right? So when you imagine a VAT plus a tariff plus all this other stuff, and I guess to diverge just slightly, VATs were kind of put in place to prevent tariffs in the first place. That's a lot of what the economic policy behind a VAT was you no longer need a tariff because everyone gets their cut of the value added tax across the supply chain. But that's neither here nor there. I don't want to diverge too much because I know this is a kind of complicated, right? But in layman's terms, what happens? Well, instead of shipping Chinese goods directly to the US, China or whatever trade partner, whatever country with the higher tariff, doesn't have to be China, will use a third party country to then ship the goods to the US, right? At a lower tariff rate. So what does that mean? Well, when we look at the supply chain security, point-to-point supply is the most secure for the most part, right? The less movement of the goods we can derive, the more secure they will be because there's less variables in the movement from point A to point B. So now we're taking potentially proprietary information, high value goods, um, raw materials, high demand raw materials, rare earth metals, and we're moving them to a third party country and then relying on security and that economic system to then move those goods to the US potentially. And this is only a one move. I mean, it's not uncommon to do 4 or 5 moves or run things through multiple different countries to then finally get them to the US because of the way tariffs laws and tax laws on that work. So the more movement we have of these goods through different points in the chain, the less secure they are. And we also add additional cost, right? It won't be as much as 145% tariff, but it's still going to cost more because we're factoring in variable costs like fuel and other things into the total cost of the consumer. So why is it important to understand that getting to these third party countries is risk to the supply chain is because you don't necessarily control what happens in those countries. Your shipment can get raided, it can get blocked in customs, it can, be hijacked. And the more times you're moving raw material or finished goods before it gets to the consumer, the more risk you're taking, right? And we talk about prohibition, right? So what does this lead to? If the chain stops and to circumvent a direct tariff, we're going through multiple third party countries, there's a chance that the chain stops, the supply slows down or it dries up. So now we're looking at black market, gray market opportunities for people. So what does that mean for companies and brands, right? Are you prepared for that? Some companies don't even have a counterfeiting division. They don't have the QC controls in place to check and see if the product that is what they're carrying their brand is actually to their QC standards. So this raises a ton of alarms and a ton of concerns, right, in the marketplace. That was a
Yeah.
lot. So I'm sorry if I lost anybody. That was a lot going on there.
I'm just thinking here because, in any production of any good, you're going to have defects.
Right.
Those defects are now effectively, now even more valuable potentially because now you can sell a defective item like, slightly zipper, whatever, may not met the quality or the standard of a major label or brand, but it's still worth something. And now basically having 145% or 245% or whatever, how much tariff that you add, especially if you think, majority um, of the educated, detailed labor is in China. That opens up, a door for these black market goods to start flooding in.
Right.
Authentic, genuine products at a discounted rate and it's coming through. And, that's just the genuine stuff, that just are defective that, maybe missing a sequin or didn't, the zipper is not as smooth as it needs to be, whatever. But I'm also thinking about, think about the number of counterfeit goods that are now going to be having to flood in because, maybe someone is going to go to, Timu or something like that and buy a counterfeit good and import it at that point because, they can't afford a luxury bag with 145, 200% tariff. They only can afford, that bag that way less, especially now because of, the cost of everything else that's going up. And so, I'm worried about these major household brands, like, my mother loves luxury purses. But I'm just thinking about the fact that, these purses are now going to be, counterfeit. And I'm reminded that like in 1997, 1998, when I was walking through Hong Kong, we would always go to the ladies' market and you could find almost everything that you want to
Yeah.
buy.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about just like, oh, this or that. No, I'm talking like every name brand. Now, whether they're real or and genuine, or they're just someone slapping the label and screen printing, I don't know. Okay, I don't claim to be an expert or anything like that. But what I'm saying is, there are huge markets for these items, and even though they've been cleaned up over the years, uh, what's happening here, it just reopens that wound essentially at that point where you're letting these goods starting to gain value and traction in the market.
Counterfeiting cost companies billions every year, and I don't think people quite understand how bad the problem is. I mean, from everything from raw materials being counterfeited, i.e., when I say counterfeiting raw materials, it's essentially selling less than what is advertised, right? So if I wanted 100% steel, I might be getting a 70, 80, 90% steel other alloy mix, which you know I'm expecting one thing, I'm paying price, I'm paying the price for that one thing, and now I'm getting something else. And we got to consider like building materials, granite, cement, all these things that are required to maintain critical infrastructure, maintain residences, maintain commercial buildings. When kind of that control goes away and things are being marketed one way, and we're getting shipments from one, things cost more, and then two, it's not the same quality, right? So the QC goes down completely when we're having to circumvent our standard levels of controls. It becomes very hard to QC when you take it from the factory, and you can do your QC intervals there, right? And you do your QC checks from the factory. It gets loaded onto a truck, whatever the material is, and then it goes on a boat, on a container, and then it goes straight to the port, straight to the consumer. We can generally believe that the QC is still what we believed it was when it left the factory. But every time we take it to multiple different stops to get it to the consumer, all of a sudden we have to question the QC. We have to QC at each one of these areas to make sure that we haven't lost the factory level quality that we want. Now, why is this important? Well, think about things like medical equipment, calibration of medical equipment, or calibration of sensitive instruments and things like that. A lot of these things are manufactured in China, right? You know, how comfortable are we with that bad QC for those type of items, right? And I know that there's been some exceptions to certain items on the tariffs, but we really need to consider some of these smaller nuances. Is like, that QC confidence level that a lot of companies are used to dealing with. They're either going to have to do one of two things. They're either going to have to open up. They're going to have to accept a lower level of quality for a higher price, or they're going to have to invest more in the QC aspect, right? So that's an added cost on top of tariffs that we're talking about in the value chain across the board. So that's a concern, right? And then the counterfeiting aspect of this too is you're going to have to remove just for brand protection. Let's just use a luxury brand like Louis Vuitton, right? How valuable is a authentic Louis Vuitton bag if you have thousands of counterfeits running out there at a similar quality level, because they're ripping off the materials from the factory that are similar to a Louis Vuitton bag. Now it's simple math for anybody, right? If you're going to have to go into the Louis Vuitton store and pay, 145% more than what you were yesterday if the good was coming from China, or you can get it for almost 70% less from a counterfeiter, similar quality on Temu, most consumers are going to go for that option. It's just simple math, right? So, there's an aspect of brand damage here that can occur as well, which, unfortunately devalues all these high-end luxury brands, also devalues any other, precision instrument, precision tooling. Callaway Golf actually had an issue with this at one point where they were creating high-end golf clubs, right? Callaway is known for their golf accessories, but they had a counterfeiting problem where factories in Vietnam, China, Thailand were using the less than stellar QC quality production runs, and they were selling them off as actual high-end carbon fiber golf clubs. And it was a huge problem because people lost confidence in the brand for a while about, well, am I getting an authentic, Callaway golf club with all the features that I paid for? Am I getting one that's not going to work as well? So there's millions lost in that too of protecting the brand as well. And so we have to consider all these factors, I think, when we look at impacts of tariffs.
Yeah, I was thinking also, it also creates bad habits.
Yeah.
And we bad habits is not in the sense that you are going to do something wrong, like, biting your nails and like that. But you create new shopping habits, as in people experience the Timu buying effect, and people are willing to actually, hey, I can get that Louis Vuitton bag, I can get that Versace bag, I can get that Coach bag, I can get that Rolex, I can get whatever I want at a fraction of discounted price at Timu. I mean, if you hold one item these days next to another item, how can you actually really tell which one is genuine? The average individual is not a skilled individual who can actually distinguish what is genuine and what is counterfeit. It's like, I poke fun at this because some of my friends love the Supreme bag. It's like, go print the logo, get it screen printed, put on a white shirt. There, you have a Supreme shirt. No one knows if it's genuine or not. And so, my thought is the same thing
Simple
here.
design.
Yeah, people won't, the average person won't know. You wear it, for the label, not for the functionality. And, at that point, does the average unsophisticated individual, when it comes to, distinguishing what is counterfeit and what's not, wouldn't tell. And you would probably fool, I want to say, what, 50, 60, 70% of the people around you. And you would get away with it, and no one would be all the wiser. And so I'm thinking it's not just a short-term effect of damaging the brand. I'm talking about a reoccurring damage at this point, because people like, hey, I can get that Versace bag for $20 instead of $2,000. You've now created that habit where I only can afford one bag a year. Now I can afford 10 of them in a
Right.
year, and
Well,
the bag disintegrates too.
it's I think the intended effect of the tariff is to spark more domestic manufacturing. At least that's what President Trump has stated the intended goal is, right? But when we look at the economies of scale, what's happening here, if to your point, if we were only able, collectively, average family, maybe one bag a year, right? Some families are like, yeah, one bag every 5 years, whatever that math is for each individual consumer. When that math is tilted on its head and essentially made to a point where, like, I can, what I thought I could only afford one, now I can afford 10 in the same time period, right? You're not helping with U.S. manufacturing at that point. This is the counterweight, right? This is the counteraction to such a punitive tariff, which we all need to be aware of. Is at some point there's a price point where the U.S. consumer says the deal's too good for me to care about buying American. Like that's just too good of a deal. I've got to jump on it, right? And I'm not passing judgment on anybody. I get it. It's just human behavior, and it's economic. It's economics, really. There's a certain, consumers are willing to pay a certain price for a certain product, and then at a lower price or significantly lower price, the price does become important. Being able to get a luxury good at a lower price is appealing to a consumer, right? And most consumers are going to be attracted to that value proposition. So, fortunately, that doesn't help spark U.S. manufacturing, because U.S. manufacturing in the current state, hopefully we get significantly better, but in the current state, we still wouldn't be able to compete with even at a reduced cost. We still wouldn't be able to compete with the prices coming out of China right now with the luxury brand. So it's I think it's China has always had the ability to do that, to flood the market with cheap goods.
And
And
it's able to go faster, to be honest. it's going to just flood way more. It's
Yeah,
going to,
true. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a better way to put it. The floodgates have been open, but now like they're they're just letting it flow at this point. And I think there is blowback to that, right? In the sense of if you add, if you don't want to allow them to directly sell in the US without that kind of tariff, they have other ways of continuing to flood the market, um, which I think overall the consumer in general, all of us, we end up losing out because we get lower quality products for either, you know, we get lower quality in general, right? All the products tend to be lower quality in these type of situations because you've got to maintain the cash flow and you're going to do it however you can, which means if you've got to mass produce things and lower the QC to get it out to keep the chain moving, you'll do that. If you just leverage the counterfeits because the actual goods, the authentic goods aren't selling because of the tariffs, then you start moving to the counterfeit situation. You start pushing that to the market. So either way, we all end up losing as consumers because the value chain is been completely kind of twisted up and tangled. So it's hopefully all I can say is there if we are able to pivot U.S. manufacturing to a place where we could address a lot of the staple good items and base level materials needed for like baseline economic development, like construction, home building, things like that. I think this would sit a little bit different, but the fact of the matter is we just don't have the manufacturing base to produce what we need for all sectors of our economy domestically. And then with tariffs on Canada and Mexico as well, it's not helping the situation, in my opinion, for you know getting raw materials in quickly at an efficient price or at a competitive price, um, because we just don't have the ability to we don't have the manpower or the manufacturing capability here to address those needs. So, I mean, we're going to have to bring stuff in from other countries. That's just an economic reality. So hopefully we can sort that out.
yeah, I was thinking, I was just saying that, like, hey, let's, you and I go to Vancouver. We can go buy and shop and just bring everything back over the border.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is what people don't realize is that the economic impact here, the PRC leadership, they're not going to feel this pinch. But who's going to feel it? Like the American consumer, you and I are going to feel it, and everyone else listening. The Chinese consumer is going to feel it, right? Your low wage, low skill, middle class, and middle class as well, and low upper class members of China are going to feel this because there's going to be measures put in place there which prevent them from moving money the way that they used to be able to. And so like the governments tend not to be that impacted by this, unfortunately, but we all are though, right? We all feel it. So, and I haven't done the math on the projected economic gain from the tariffs, but from what I can tell, I mean, what I'm looking at and everything that I'm hearing coming out of China right now is they're going to find ways to circumvent these tariffs because these tariffs were so punitive that it's they'll find ways around it, whether it's third party countries in South America, Africa, leveraging Canada, which they've done in the past. They've leveraged Canada to a great effect in the past by getting ownership in Canadian companies and in moving product that way. So I don't think it's going to slow them down the way people think it is.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if a country manages to sign a free trade agreement, with China, and then from there use that as a relay point to import goods at a, like, let's say 10% tariff into the United States. Even with
Yeah.
that additional hop, additional labor, you might only be incurring another, what, 20-30% of the cost of the actual tariff. And on scale and in mass, you're spreading that cost around at that point. So potentially, a lot of money could be made if you had the resources to set up these, shadow importing companies.
Right. So that takes us to another another interesting point as we look at Mexico and Canada. Okay, so what do we know? So there's also talk. Okay, so we have tariffs, right? We have counterfeiting and then the supply chain security aspect there. But then what we also know about Mexico and cartels, there's been a lot of pressure put on cartels, right? We know that's a pressure point that's being applied right now to Mexico. But who owns a lot of the import and transport and logistics companies in Mexico and South America in general? Well, you have a lot of cartel influence in that aspect as well, right? So like if we play the game here, we already know a lot of fentanyl raw materials was coming from China and Southeast Asia to Mexico, either being transported as raw materials into the United States and then being put together as labs here, or being processed in the lab in Mexico and then transported as raw fentanyl. Well, that logistics chain can shift pretty easily to counterfeit goods as well. It's not difficult to do. I mean, you're talking about a port, you're talking about trucking, and you're talking about shipping and permitting. It's not hard to do. So,
I
you
just had
know,
this. I just had this picture that you just said that of these cartels packing a submarine full of Intel CPUs and just like going
well,
up.
I, I mean, it's kind of like this. It's like
And it'd be more valuable, more lucrative, and safer.
I mean, they were transporting drugs quite a bit until transporting humans became more lucrative, right? And they pivoted to transporting humans and transporting drugs. So, cartels, regardless of what people's view of the cartels are, but I mean, cartels to their core tend to be business people. They want to make money. It's a money making enterprise that these people are about. It's the unregulated, unchecked pursuit of that limitless capital that they can make selling the products that they do that causes a lot of the violence, right? But and this is going to sound funny to a lot of people, but cartels get into the smuggling counterfeit goods business. You could have gunfights over Gucci bags, because there's money to be made in that. And a cartel will fight a rival cartel for rights to transport counterfeit Nike shoes or whatever through certain corridors to get into the United States and continue to make money. So, not saying that it's going to be an all out, bloodbath, but, it's really controlling those logistical points across South America into the US and into Mexico into the US that makes these cartels a lot of money. And so that doesn't change simply because they stop transporting drugs for a short while, right? And transport something else. They're still going to make a ton of money transporting whatever it is that they're transporting.
Yeah, but I think kind of like the evolution of cybercrime. You don't rob a bank physically with guns anymore. You just rob a bank digitally. It's more safer.
Right.
And I kind of think of it this way, unloading an iPhone or a processor on the gray market, if not possibly black market at this point, is way safer than dealing with fentanyl or
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
and
It carries less crime sentences for sure.
you don't have to sell at 145% of the tariff. You just
No.
need to sell at 125% of that tariff. So that margin of that 125% goes to these cartels at this point. And that's profit for them, minus, overhead costs, logistics, whatever. But
Minimal risk too, on their end, right?
yeah,
Minimal risk because, I mean, it all looks, and this is the thing, it all looks legitimate, right? Because what are you transporting? You're not transporting bags of powder or rocks anymore. You're not having to hide anything. You're just transporting what looks like legitimate goods,
yeah,
person, bags, GPUs, raw materials. It looks like legitimate goods, and it's very difficult to, unless you sit there and you do a QC check at each one of these points and verify, like for metals exam, you've got to literally take a sample out, boil it or not boil it, but heat it up and process it and figure out what is the actual metallic makeup, right? It's not feasible to do that at each stop along the way to verify that this is legit or not, right?
Right.
So, and quite frankly, a lot of processing plants for raw materials, they can process various different purities of whatever, right? So they understand, like, look, if you give it to me 70% pure, that's fine. I can still process it. And at the price point you're selling it to me for, I'm happy to just refine it 70% and figure it out, right? I'll have less volume, but my overhead and everything else is going to go down, dramatically if I'm not having to pay a 145 tariff on it. So I'll refine it 70% versus 90 directly from China. That's fine, right? A lot of businesses are going to look at it that way.
And I think it also brings some good questions, about the quality workmanship. And I'm reminded, as we're talking here, of the recent earthquake that happened in Mandalay, Thailand, or Malaysia, or Burma, or
Yeah,
Myanmar.
I think it was, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but I was reminded, in Bangkok, a tower was built, a brand new one, and just some vibrations, not the full, it's not, yes, it's in the earthquake zone, but it's in Bangkok, but that entire tower collapsed, and you can see, based on the initial reports, that there may have been shoddy rebar that may have been imported in, and that kind of makes me kind of question, like, oh wow, now you have not just supply chain integrity issues of it. When theoretically you could maybe take a product, find a way to split in half and diversify it into two uh, lower quality products, kind of like how you do with the drug trades, or you could potentially import so and so product or good through another country that is being with a lower tariff, and then sell it as the higher quality product at the same time too, just like your medical devices examination, but sorry, medical electronic devices. And I'm thinking from a perspective of not just at that level, I'm thinking more at the raw material level here, where you may not catch it until you start refining it or purifying it, and then realizing the quality of that material isn't as good as you actually originally thought it might be, until
Yeah.
you go through a QA QC process. By then, how much are you sitting on at that point? You just don't know.
And it brings up another kind of concern of um sitting on product, right? Like if you like economies ebb and flow, and when you see the factors, what's going on, some businesses are sitting on inventory may not want to release the inventory. They're like, you know what, we're going to sit on it, we're going to hold it, we're going to hedge our bets that um as materials kind of dry up and as demand increases, then we'll start flowing things out. OPEC does this all the time with oil. I mean, we see this all the time with OPEC and the price of oil. And so when you look at this kind of market manipulation, there's when the full, I think the full understanding and scope of the tariffs are not fully understood yet. And until we really get a full picture on that, until they've kind of been in place for some time, we're not really going to know what's going to happen. But because of that uncertainty, and because many businesses are kind of like, hey, I don't actually know what's going to happen right now, so I'm actually going to sit on this inventory and not let it go because I want to kind of see how this all shapes up and how it all plays out, right? That's going to impact supply chain too.
Yep.
And that's going to cause, some potential issues to a point where when more and more counterfeits start hitting the market, the actual authentic goods are going to skyrocket in price, especially if they're able to be verified, especially if you can go direct to consumer with those goods. So if you know that's going to happen, what incentive do you have to get your product out to market until the full scope and full picture is out there? When potentially all historical data shows that an authentic good in a market crowded full of counterfeits, there is someone willing to pay a premium for it, right?
Right.
Because they can verify it's authentic and they verify it's actually real. And so, you talk about things like GPUs, medical devices, things like that. The question becomes, all right, wait, are we getting the best stuff money can buy? Or are we getting what the market will support on counterfeit or less than stellar quality, right? So, I mean, these are all things that I don't know if everyone is fully aware of, but it really all these factors really do impact your business and the risk profile of your business. You know, if you're in the hospital system, now you have another risk factor that you really need to be focused on, right? If you're, if you're into manufacturing or if you're into, supply chain, third party logistics, things like that, these are all things you got to be aware of and worried about that you weren't necessarily as worried about before. And now you have to bring the focus back to these things.
Yeah, and I'm just so curious now as I'm thinking this, we also just make our tagline, what could possibly go wrong at this rate? But I'm just thinking like it just opens the door for just so much to go wrong at every level of it. And we're just talking about the good side of it, we're not even just talking about the import practice of it as well. Like I could just see, on multiple levels, you know, on the I'm not accusing anyone in the federal government doing this, okay? But I'm saying there is a certain added incentive to you know, potentially incentivize to turning a blind eye on both sides of the fence to import or export goods out from countries. And you're just essentially increasing the risk of corruption at that level too. And then, now you're also opening up potentially for other unintended goods or services to be incentivized to be going back across the border, because now you have essentially set up a leaky border at that point. And unfortunately, at the same time, a sort of Damocles dangling over these custom agents across
Yeah,
multiple countries.
and I mean, when you look at some of the volumes of money that we're talking about, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's very far out of the realm of possibility that corruption increases across any international border, not just ours. Um, and then given if you're using third party countries that may not have had the economic boom or were not necessarily um, in play before, and now they're all of a sudden getting exposure as a third party country to skirt tariffs. Um, that infrastructure is not in place for countering the corruption, for the checks and controls of what's going in and out. And so you got to start asking yourself, it's like, okay, we may have prevented like a set of problems that were top of mind to us, but did we just create 10 to 15 more that we weren't aware of? And now how do we keep a lid on those? Because I think if you don't understand supply chain, or if you don't understand kind of how business is done globally, um, point to point is typically your best way to do this, because you have more control of what happens on the shipping end and what happens on the receiving end. As you start getting more and more, parties involved across that chain, it gets very complicated, especially if you're talking about multiple continents, especially if you're talking about different cultures that don't necessarily do business the same way that we're used to doing business in the United States or Western Europe. It gets very complicated. And, I don't, I'm not sure if, if we'll know the full ROI and cost benefit of the tariffs until we start getting the data on some of this other stuff that potentially could happen, right? And that it's kind of like you want one regime to kind of get in compliance and be a fair trade partner. But if you create six more in the process by trying to get that trade partner in compliance that are also crooked trade partners, you didn't really solve your problem. You just created six new problems that you got to deal with, right? So I think it's something that we won't really know the full impact of all this until we get some of this data and figure out what the method of skirting the tariffs are going to be. Because I think one thing is for sure clear is that the tariffs will be skirted. They will, countries will find a way to flow around them. We've seen this over and over again historically, whether it's sanctions, whether it's taxes, VATs, tariffs, any type of financial like penalty or financial added cost to a product, people will try to find a way to get around it.
Yeah, I think we can look back in history, like at multiple industries, like the music industry for is a great example. It used to be you had to buy a record or a CD, you pay that 12, 13, $15, $20 for a CD. Yes, we're dating ourselves in this conversation. Um,
And you bought it for two singles, right? But
yeah,
but you got so you basically paid $12 for two singles, and you got 10 other songs,
that that you may or may not like in that
yeah.
process, kind of deal. And then, that opened up a whole underground economy for Napster and the
Oh,
peer-to-peer
yeah.
sharing and Kazaa and all those things. And, digital music took off from there. Yes, they got hammered for, copyright infringement and piracy. But, at the same time, if you think about it too, it also set the stage for a disruption with iTunes. And you saw when iTunes came in with 99 cents music, it actually really curbed all of that instantly because now people are, downloading a half quality song, they're downloading a genuine song, they own a license to it, they can listen on the musical device and ecosystem, and poof, that really curved it down. And then add streaming into the fact that even curbed down, the piracy, even more at this point. But, you know, I keep thinking, how do you smuggle in a tractor or a car? Probably going to be very, very difficult to do so, but not impossible. You can smuggle a human. You could probably smuggle a tractor with no problem. Um, but I'm thinking like, all those smaller goods that we might be importing, processors, memory chips, SSDs, um, bags, jewelry, luxury goods, everyday goods. We're opening ourselves for a world of hurt. And I'm not even thinking about the fact that, wow, what happens if we start importing counterfeit medicine too, as well? Because a lot of the medicine is actually, if I'm mistaken, is made in China or mass produced in China.
Yeah, a lot of medications are, and so that's another issue that we have, right? QC of meds.
So, I'm thinking about this like, I have a headache. Like, this is not going to go well for us. As I think, people are going to get hurt. It isn't just, hey, I bought this, nail clipper. It's made in China. Okay, oh wait, it's the wrong grade of steel. Okay, there's no impact. No, I'm thinking, someone buying an iPhone and when they boot it up, they get a pear phone, or they buy an electronic device and it's. I'm reminded of this joke. It came to the back on my feed the other day. It was someone bought it's like an iPhone 7 or something like that. But that was the joke. But they put an iPhone 3 and an iPhone 4 and then threw in a fusion card from Yu-Gi-Oh to call it an iPhone 7. Uh, but I'm just thinking like, it just opens the door for just so much abuse at this point
Right.
that, people are going to do almost everything and anything to circumvent it. And at that point, risk lives, risk their businesses, risk operations. The risk just goes up tenfold at this point. It just doesn't make, sense. And yes, you can argue the fact that, oh, well, because the risks are so great, people are going to, import it the correct way. I disagree because I think people are willing to accept that risk nominally because the risk is, if it works out, then it pans into their favor at that point. And going forward, they have a trusted relationship or a trusted supplier, and they will keep using them as long as that trust isn't betrayed.
Well, I mean, I think we actually saw this domestically with the egg supply, right? I mean, there was a bird flu in the egg supply. So your typical, 4 or 5 massive egg manufacturers, uh, they were kind of out of action. I mean, they were selling eggs at 15, 16, $17 a dozen, right? And so I think I saw the highest I saw was like $22 for a dozen eggs, right? So let's apply that kind of model to the tariffs, right? If your raw material costs are, 3xing, 4xing because of the tariffs, um, there is going to be somebody who can get the raw material to market at a more acceptable price point, right? And that's what we saw, at least here in California, and I think it happened across the country as well. But small independent farmers who had access to eggs, who weren't in the national distribution chain for eggs and weren't impacted by the bird flu, were able to come in, and their prices traditionally, those producers, their prices are higher because they're smaller independent farms, but people were willing to pay $8 for a carton of eggs at that point because the alternative was $14.99, $16.99 for a carton of eggs. So these small independent suppliers were able to actually source and get product to the market at a price point that the market was willing to accept. So
Probably
if
a
you look
little
at
bit more.
that,
They could probably sell at the 10.99 price point and still rake in a little bit more profit too as well.
yeah, yeah. And so I think if we use that whole egg situation, and it's still kind of going on here in the U.S. Because I haven't seen eggs for 3.50. I mean, I remember I used to get them for 2.99, $3. I haven't seen that price in a while. But that's exactly my point, right? Is that economic conditions change, somebody will come in and fill the gap. Somebody will find a way, and it's not going to be maybe the price that, like, I still haven't seen independent producers produce eggs anything below $7. Um, However, I'm more willing to pay 7, 8, $9 for a carton of eggs than I am 15, 16, 17, 18, $19, right? And if you guys remember during COVID, there were people selling rolls of toilet paper on the side of the road, and people were willing to pay, $10 a roll for toilet paper. And none of us thought that was weird during COVID. None of it. We all understood why. We understood why the guy was selling toilet paper on the side of the road for $10 a roll. We knew why, right? So similarly, like, we understand when economic conditions change, whether it be by tariffs, whether it be by market conditions, whether it be by something else, natural disaster. Um, People are very empathetic as to why people go another course of action to get what they need, right? So wouldn't surprise me if American companies and domestic producers, domestic manufacturers did go a certain route to obtain raw material. I'm not saying illegally, but I'm saying going to third party countries and buying Chinese steel or buying Mexican products or something like that from a third party country that don't have the same tariff impacts as a direct sale.
You
Wouldn't
actually,
surprise
you
me.
actually bring up a very fun point in this. Um, markets in economics are inherently designed to correct itself in one way or another. And, our conversation has been focused on new goods. But now I'm wondering, as I'm having this conversation with you, does it actually open up a brand new black market for used goods as well?
Think so. I think used parts. If we look at if we look at what happened during COVID, used cars were selling at the highest blue book values you had ever seen, sometimes over blue book value,
Right.
um, because you could not produce a new car. The GPUs were being used and required in new cars just were hard to come by, right? So used cars blew up. And I mean, I mean, I got multiple offers on my vehicle. But I like my truck, so I'm not selling it. But I could have recouped almost. I think I would have got about 80% of the sale price of what I paid for the car in 2008 when I got it in 2020. I bought the car in 2008. So 12 years later, I would have recouped almost 80% of the sale price. That's unheard of. That's unheard of. And I think to your point, I think the used goods market will absolutely blow up. And there's risk to that too, right? Because when you get a used good, and I'm not opposed to buying used goods. I mean, I'm into some hobbies, like surfing and other hobbies. where I buy a lot of used product because you can pretty much count on it, but it's easy to tell the wear and tear on on a surfboard. You can visually see it. You can see if there's damage to the board. You can check the fins and see, okay, you know what, like these are still good. These meet specs. That's a relatively simple item and product, right? But when we talk about like auto parts or we talk about industrial parts, we talk about highly sensitive calibration stuff like x-ray machines. Um, you know, here's the risk there, right? If I'm sitting on 10 used x-ray machines that are sitting in my warehouse at a hospital and I want to get rid of them, but I know they need to be recalibrated. I know that there's a significant cost in there, but I need to get rid of them and I know that there's a market for them. I, I'm not saying people would do this, but you have incentive to potentially fudge the logs or present the unit being better than it actually is, right? So I think we have to be worried about that. We have to look at that too. You know, what goods and services are you getting that are being, supported and processed by, potentially used goods? Is there a risk there? Is there a risk in the supply chain? Is there a risk to the construction? Is there a risk to the manufacturing? And look, I'll say there's nothing wrong with using used goods if you can verify that it's within spec and you can verify the shelf life left on it. So you can do a proper maintenance schedule and everything like that. But you know, uncertain economic times cause people to do things that they wouldn't normally do, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean.
And that's kind of what I'm thinking. Like, going back to our theme of prohibition when we first started this conversation, you know, uh, you had to procure alcohol some way, somehow during prohibition. But I'm also thinking about, I think during prohibition, there was quite a bit of turf wars between the various gangs and importers too, as well. And so I'm just thinking, wow, with the used good market, does it incentivize a baddie to go and take that purse off of somebody because it's a coach bag? Or does it ever, does it open up the door for people to do more pickpocketing to get iPhones or whatever? Does it open up a whole new market for these secondary stolen goods and sell because they're high demand, there's low inventory, or sorry, there is high demand, there is low affordable inventory. Let me
Yeah.
clarify. There's low affordable inventory. And, some people are willing to pay, 50, 60, 70% less. And, at that point, a stolen good it's basically pure profit at that point. So,
Well,
wow.
look at catalytic converters. I mean, it's still a problem, right? We still get a lot of catalytic converter thefts throughout the United States because it's a high demand, low density product. There's not enough of them out there. If I'm able to steal it off your car, I can sell it for, even 20-30% of what you would have to, what full market value is. I'm still making a ton of money. So, I think when we look at that model of like, we still have a lot of catalytic converter thefts. And San Francisco had a really big problem about the iPhone laptop theft, right? Because because the black market was established there, good, bad, or indifferent. It was established there very well for the iPhones and the laptops. It was understood, that there's a certain threshold that gets you in jail on value of the product, and there's a certain threshold that keeps you on the streets. And so, if you know what that is, you can steal, not go to jail. You can sell the stolen property to somebody, and the shops that were selling the stolen property knew exactly when they were going to come to inspect the inventory and when they weren't. And they had their little methods of come to the back room. I've got a deal for you, and oh, I don't have anything in the back room. So I think if we kind of look historically at what has happened in some of these areas like San Francisco or other urban areas that specifically are impacted by certain economic things. San Francisco is a tech hub, massive tech hub. So we, on a micro level, we know laptops anything high tech, Bluetooth headphones, iPhones, all this stuff is super high in demand in that area, right? So if somebody either breaks one, loses one, something like that, they want to be able to replace it quickly, efficiently, and at a price point that doesn't break the bank. People know what Apple costs, what Apple charges for a replacement iPhone if you don't have an Apple Care plan. It's not pretty, right? So, if you can get a similar model that's used for a third of that price, you're probably going to go with that option if you can.
Yeah. Ish. That's just fun. I'm just thinking of like how one small import tax is causing just a ton of challenges down the line here. It's just kind of scary. And all the, additional risks to personal safety, your businesses, just by having your work laptop stolen or something like that. All the way now to potentially, the quality of the goods that you're importing and then reselling out, and all the way down to you have basically multiple potentially black markets going forward just for you know shadow routes to import goods back into your country. And once you've established that, you have a formal process, essentially, undocumented, but more or less it's a formal process at this point, to where it can be abused to deliver almost anything at this point.
Well, I mean, I'll add one more layer to the pain. I mean, imagine so company refreshes, right? So, we know companies like to refresh tech. It's typically every 2 years on a tech forward contract, right? Dell, Apple, whoever, you buy assets year one, the end of year two, you can either trade them in and get a credit and buy new tech, or you can, essentially keep them and then try to sell them third party to another company that wants to use them, right? It's simply how these contracts are structured. Well, I think those are going to be structured now 3 years, right? Because manufacturing and supply chain will be impacted. So you're looking at a tech refresh every 3 years. Well, what does that mean? Like, what is the big picture of that, right? Well, okay, if you're waiting now 3 years to refresh tech, all the development in AI, all the development on these other tooling and apps, like it's kind of dependent on being on the latest iOS operating system if you're Apple, if you're an Apple user, Microsoft, whatever that is, being able to support patches and updates, right? So you may not be able to use the best efficiency tools because of an inability to get new tech. On top of that, what if your tech gets stolen? Like, if I had the laptop year one and then the end of year two, somebody stole it, the cost of replacing that laptop is astronomical today than what it was 2 years ago. So, think about the impact of the business on IT assets and think about what that means for the end user. Like, are you now going to have to owe the company money if your laptop gets stolen, if the insurance won't cover it, because we've priced these things out of reason, due to tariffs and raw material costs.
or just
So
or just even just spare parts just to fix the laptop, because they more or less come from a single source in the world, generally China and Foxconn. So,
we
just
we really got we
how
really
they
got
come
to
by.
look. I'm sorry, yeah. I mean, we really got to look at how will this impact our day to day, right? And like some industries, they use a lap. I mean, the laptop's not that important. I know tech, where kind of I sit in that space a little bit. Um, yeah, it's generally important to have the latest and greatest tech because you're running, you're on the bleeding edge. What stocks are really driving the economy right now? Like the tech stocks, right? So there is an economic impact here that we all need to be aware of. There's a security impact that we all need to be aware of. And that we have to approach this with eyes wide open, in my opinion. We can't just be like, okay, tariffs are in place, great, business as usual. It's like, no, 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 not quite. We need to plan and prepare for what's potentially coming.
Right. And I think that opens up just, so many possibilities just to think about, you know, where things are going to go towards. Is it going to go towards, more black market economies, or is it more gray markets, or, if just people bite the bullet? And my gut instinct at the moment says, it's going to go more black market at this rate because you're just with, the cost of living just going higher and your income is not really going up to that, then all your forced resort is like, you have to survive some way, somehow. So that means
Well,
you're
yeah,
going to do what it takes to survive.
I think it's no doubt in my mind that it will be a black market economy for, I mean, one, we haven't really recovered. I mean, 3 years ago, two years ago, big tech started the layoffs, right? Um, and from my understanding, there's still 25% of the people who were laid off 2 years ago are still unemployed, still haven't found like consistent work outside of maybe gig economy stuff, small, short-term contracts here and there. They haven't found full-time work. We know that there's probably likely going to be more layoffs in the future, and there's been rolling layoffs for 2025, and that's just one sector. As one sector is impacted, other sectors are going to be impacted as well, right? So you think about if a tech office closes or lays off, 300 people, what about all that supporting infrastructure there, like the office workers, or excuse me, the restaurateurs, the bars, everything around that kind of supports that economy, all that's impacted, right? So looking at the market, looking at the economics of the last 2 years, I really don't, all signs point to black markets being the solution for a lot of people's answers right now. Which it's an unfortunate consequence, but the reality of the situation is it's a saturated job market right now, very saturated. It's an uncertain economic time, good, bad, or indifferent. So companies are very shy about deploying capital in certain projects and bringing on new people if they're not quite sure what direction we're going. And then now add tariff tension, right? So now raw material costs are potentially going to be uncertain. So basically, I see rises in black markets when economic uncertainty is present. Right now, we have a lot of economic uncertainty. You know, I see, I just see it being a consequence of the conditions. Not all just, and it's not all just the tariffs. I want to be clear about that. It's not all just the tariffs that are doing that, but I think the tariffs are, part of a broader economic condition globally that's going to lead to, a lot more of this black market stuff.
Yeah, I agree on that one tremendously. And, it kind of worries me now because, like I used to do wholesale distribution and, you know, I always like to source things from the major tier ones. But, sometimes it is too tempting to get something from the gray market because the gray market, my margins are just way, way, way better. So instead
Yep.
of my normal like 12, 15%, I was seeing like 25 or 30% margins because I was able to procure something from the gray markets. And yes, every so often I would get a bad item, but the cost of losing a bad item is just like one out of every 100, 200, or
Yeah, I
three.
mean it's the same as your defective cost on newly manufactured goods, right? I mean 1 in 10, 1 in 20, it's going to happen, but you know um,
What's the cost of doing business? That,
cost.
that, that
Well, I mean, I think the other issue here too is like just standard businesses, right? Like when you price out, like markets get priced out, right? So, when you look at what the market is willing to pay for a certain good or service, when when that good on official channels is too pricey for people, um, the demand doesn't necessarily go down per se initially, right? People still want the item. They either can't afford it or they have other responsibilities which won't allow them to afford it, right? Because they have to prioritize other things, right? Um, and so it becomes very attractive to like if you can still get what you wanted at a back into the price point that you were initially willing to pay for it, that becomes a very attractive option to a lot of people, especially as they get priced out of things that they're used to having, right? Like eggs, for example. We are used to having eggs for access to eggs, right?
and
Uh,
toilet
I definitely don't recommend buying black market eggs. I think you'll all be very disappointed. But I mean, the point is, you know, there's someone who's willing to go straight to the farmer and be like, "Hey, man, give me every egg you got." I know a lot of people who created chicken farms, right? They're like, "Screw it. If I gotta pay 16 bucks for a carton, I'm just gonna grow my own. I'm just gonna get my own eggs and my own chickens. I'm gonna create a chicken coop in the backyard. I'm gonna get chickens all. I'm gonna get eggs, all day, every day. I'm good.
Excellent.
But I mean, we have to look at these conditions and think about how do those factor like similar factors, how's that going to impact my industry specifically, right?
And I think, with everything so integrated as we are, you can't keep it out. And we've seen it happen with the embargoes in Russia. Like, no matter how much we try to sanction them and embargo them into the Stone Ages, things are still getting in through multiple intermediaries. And then, I just don't see how it's possible. It's when there's a will, there's going to be a way, and that's kind of been, one thing I love about doing pen testing and red teaming is that human creativity, that human ingenuity coming in to say, how do I get around these processes? And if anything has taught me over the years of just doing red teaming and pen testing and risk management is that people will find a way. Kind of like the drastic part, life will find a way.
People are crafty. People are crafty, so
Yeah.
they'll find a way to get what they want and get what they need. I mean, you could look at any prison population in the United States or anywhere. I mean,
Exactly.
you can get, if you pay the right price or the right people and do the right, you can get whatever you want in prison too. There's a way to do it. And so we have to consider these things like, what vector is going to be used to potentially, put my company at risk or, put my organization at risk, in order to circumvent, tariffs or sanctions. Because I mean, there's tons of ways to do it. And so I think the other big thing here is, with that uncertainty that we've been talking about, you know, proprietary information, insider risk, how you treat employees, you know, how well you're communicating with your employees about what's going on. These all become extremely important because every one of these people is just ripe for exploitation, by a competitor or by a nefarious force to be exploited to get around specific things. So what's your insider threat program look like? What, have you done your audits? Do you have your balance and controls set up so you can do audit and compliance effectively and ensure that you're doing things the way they need to be done and people inside aren't, being corrupted per se, right? Because all this becomes super important when you have economic conditions the way that you do, and then you have, multiple competitors looking for that one piece of raw material that they need to move their business along.
Gosh, now all of a sudden I'm just picturing instead of handing briefcase full of money, you just handing over USB thumb drives full of Bitcoin.
I mean, not not far from reality right now, to be honest. Not far from reality.
All right. We've hit a little over an hour. Al, final thoughts for this week's podcast?
Yeah, final thoughts. You know, look at don't just worry about the cost, right? Don't just look at the first order effect. We all know everything's going to cost more with tariffs, but what next? What's second, third, fourth, fifth order effects? Like beyond cost, beyond price. What does that lead to? What does that lead to in your organization? What does it lead to in your community? What's it lead to in your overall place, right? So make sure that you're mitigating all risks, not just that one.
Yeah. I'm going to build upon yours. Like, I think from a business perspective, you just have to keep kind of going down that rabbit hole. If you're not going down your rabbit hole only for, supply chain anyway, you're probably having to do that anyways, even further now, because now you're trying to making sure that, people coming in from the sides don't just kind of weave their way in to take advantage of that additional margin and profit from it essentially. Somebody somehow by lowering it or doing something funny. I think also the one I would be concerned about is just personal. Whoever you deal business with, shop with, or buy from, you may need to potentially ask some very, very hard questions potentially, because for all you know, you might be getting, that Pear phone instead of that Apple iPhone. So, I think, it's going to put some pressure on what's going to be genuine and what's not. And I think, for those of us, who are unsophisticated buyers like myself, we're probably going to have to spend way more time doing the research, making sure that whatever we're buying, whether brand new or refurbished or pre-owned or pre-loved, we're gonna have to spend a little extra time just making sure we're getting what we're buying, and not someone just rebadging something and calling it what it is when it's really not.
Yep.
All right, folks. So I think that's it for this week's podcast. So again, change your schedule unless Al something mysteriously has no travel again next week. We're off next week. So I'll get that episode that my plan was to upload that ISC West episode from 2 weeks ago. No, three next week. I'll get uploaded this week regardless. So we'll go dark next week, and then we'll be back then the week after. So thanks for listening for this week's podcast. Do drop us a line. Let us know what your thoughts are. We'd love to hear your comments about this. Do also share a topic too as well, or invite someone to subscribe or listen to the podcast as well. We want to just share our thoughts and challenge people to think about the different risks and security even more as we push these episodes into a bigger, war audience.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah. So until next time. Also, for those of you wondering if I'm going to be at RSA, I have no plans to be at RSA this year. Tariffs have cut and restricted my firm's budgets for unnecessary travel. So sorry, I won't be able to, I will miss you guys in next week. But for those of you who are going, have fun and be safe.
Yeah, have fun, guys. Is it in Vegas this year, or is it in San Francisco again?
San Francisco.
Okay. Well, watch your laptop bags. That's all I can tell you.
And your iPhones. All right, folks. That's Al. I'm Josh, and we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good, guys.